Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time with us on a Thursday afternoon. Today's conversation is going to be focused on Budget Advocacy 101. This is the next edition in our monthly Alliance Advocacy Workshop series. So, if this is your first time or your fifth time with us, welcome. We are going to be spending the rest of this hour just going into greater depth around certain advocacy strategies. This week, again, we're going to be focusing more specifically on the budget. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and at any point ask any questions in the Q&A box. Before we get started, a couple of quick housekeeping items. Number one, we just want to make sure that we remind folks that this is a safe and inclusive space. The Alliance has a zero tolerance policy for any kind of violent or abusive behavior or language. If you do see any concerns, please let myself, Tamina, or Charles know by messaging us directly on Zoom. But otherwise, thank you so much for helping us keep this space safe and inclusive. Again, please use the chat box to introduce yourself if you'd like. Use the Q&A box for any and all questions you have for the panelists. Please don't ask that in the chat. We won't be able to see it otherwise. We will share the slides and the recording of this webinar with you all, hopefully by tomorrow. So don't worry too much. We will make sure we get that content out to you right away. As a final reminder, I think most folks already are part of our advocacy network, but if you are not already, this is the way that you find out about these webinars. You get a monthly bulletin from us that provides updates on our advocacy work, what you need to know, what's going on in Capitol Hill, how you can plug in. We send periodic action alerts, what's the most urgent thing that Congress needs to hear from you about, and then we also have some virtual office hours with our advocacy director. So I will put that link again just in 1 second in the chat about how to make sure you are plugged into our advocacy network. So today's workshop, really excited. We have two in-house Alliance experts. As usual, we have Tamina Chowdhury kicking us off. She's the Director of Advocacy and Campaign Strategy here at the Alliance. We're also joined by our recent hire, Charles Williams. He is the Director of Congressional Affairs. So without further ado, we're going to get right into the content, and Tamina is going to give us some framing for today's discussion on budget advocacy.
Thank you so much, Alec. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to walk you through how to effectively engage your members of Congress. As some of you know, we are at the appropriations season here in DC, and so hopefully this session is going to be helpful for you to think about the next couple of weeks and how you will advocate with your members of Congress. So this is a really practical session. The goal is that by the end of it, you feel ready to make a clear ask with your member of Congress, tell your story, and then follow through in a way that influences funding decisions. Let's get us started. Next slide, please. Excellent. So we know that federal funding decisions impact homelessness outcomes in your communities, right? We know that there are programs and funding levels at federal government that goes into states and localities that impact how we're able to manage and hopefully end homelessness. So appropriations isn't really an abstract. It's a when you think about appropriations, think about is in real dollars for programs and policies that we rely on for COCs, SAMHSA, HAG funding, etc. So what's really key is to remember the timing. This window is short, but it's also one of the most highest impact moments to advocate. So if there's only one time in the year that you have capacity to advocating or you want to advocate, appropriation process is really the campaign you want to be part of. Next slide, please. So before I jump into what is appropriations, I'm curious if you could put in the chat, when you hear the word appropriations, what comes to your mind? There's no right or wrong answer, so feel free to share whatever comes to mind. So So appropriations is the really the annual process where Congress decides how much funding programs actually get. It's driven by the House and Senate appropriations committees, so both chambers have their own appropriations committees, and they play a key role in funding for housing and homelessness. And one of the ways they do that is through the THUD subcommittee. And Charles, my colleague, is going to talk to you more about this. And the process moves in phases, right? So it starts from with requests from members to the committees, and then they go and they take those ideas and draft them into a language. Then there are negotiations based on that language, and then they both houses pass the final bill, which eventually ends up on the president's desk, which is then signed into law. So that's really a very high level appropriations process and what it does. Next slide, please. And in this process, as I was saying at the top, your voice really does make a difference here. Members of Congress prioritize what they hear from their constituents, which is all of you, especially when there is a clear local impact. And their staffs also rely heavily on trusted local partners, which can be you, to inform their decisions and to advise their members. So strong advocacy can increase funding. We know it can prevent cuts and even shape how programs are implemented through report language and through advocacy, which could be an annual day of advocacy, but which can be consistent also if you're in district or in DC advocating in their offices. Next slide, please. However, not every member approaches appropriations the same way. It helps to think about them in three buckets. So there's the first bucket who are the supporters, and these are members who generally support the programs and the funding every year, and our role really is to reinforce and push them further. And there's the second bucket, which is the members on the fence. So these members are neither supporter or opposers, and they could be their minds could be changed based on persuasion. So they're open to hearing what their constituents have to say on a certain issue, especially when it comes to local issues. And they usually tend to lean towards local and economic arguments. And they're the final bucket, which are the members who generally oppose the funding and the programs and the policies. And this is where the strategy is more about pressure, uh, potentially to neutralize them. So if they oppose something, uh, our ask is for them to take a neutral position and also to bring, and this is one of the ways we can do is bringing unexpected voices, which I'll touch on more in the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. So when you're framing your message with your member, anchor it in what the member cares most about, right? Is it their re-election that's coming up in a year, or, which often means they care about visible local impact. They also care, some members care deeply about economic prosperity or jobs, workforce development. And some also care about public safety. And most members, if not all members, are there to listen to the stories of their constituents and their party priorities at the same time. But the more you connect your issue to the policies that they care about, the more it resonates with them, despite their party affiliation, and higher the chance of either supporting or taking a neutral position based on the policies and issues you're advocating for. Next slide, please. And there are a lot of tactics you can engage. Meetings, which could be either in the DC office or in district offices, are key. But you don't underestimate the power of calls, emails, site visits, coalition letters with diverse messengers, media pressure through op-eds, and also reaching out to your mayors and business leaders who have a strong say in how community needs are met and would could be an ally for your cause. And the best way to do it is to reach out and try to build those allies and relationship, and maybe in the process educating them as well on the issues that you are an expert in. Next slide, please. So, what separates effective advocacy from noise is that effective advocacy is when you make a clear and specific ask, you share local data paired with real stories, so people with lived experience of homelessness, and the right messenger. Consistency matters too. This isn't just a one and done deal when you meet with them or send them an email. Follow-ups are very important. And finally, coordination, which means working together to amplify your impact. Our current appropriations campaign, we are taking a very strategic approach to coordinating efforts by all of you in the field so that your members are hearing the same message from different audiences. So that's coordination, which comes from strategy and planning, depending on the kind of member you have in Congress. Next slide, please. So your ask should always be three things: be specific, be timely, and make sure it's actionable. You're not just asking for them to support homelessness programs. You're saying, please support at least X dollars for this program in this fiscal year. Being direct like that actually makes it easier for their staff and the members to act. Next slide, please. Now, stories are one of the most underutilized advocacy tactics used in the homelessness sphere. A strong story which carries a message combines three elements like data, a human story, and a solution. Carry a big weight with your member, no matter who your member of Congress is. So talking about people's stories, how your communities are impacted, how people in your communities who are homeless are impacted, and what that looks like on the ground is really a powerful way to support homelessness policies and funding with your federal legislature. But keep it short and easy to follow. Next slide, please. Now, who delivers the stories and the messages is just as important as the message itself. For instance, service providers, they bring credibility because they have worked with people with a lived experience, or they've worked directly with homelessness folks. People with lived experience also bring a level of urgency. Businesses and faith leaders, they can bring different perspectives on this. And then local officials can often carry political weight and relationship with their members. A mix of all of these voices is powerful. Next slide, please. So here's a simple flow when you're thinking about meeting with your member on appropriations. Request a meeting, prepare your team so everyone knows their role, deliver a clear message, make the ask directly, and then finally, and perhaps most importantly, follow up. The last step is where a lot of group of folks fall short, but it's really critical to your advocacy. Next slide, please. So both district and DC engagements matter, but they serve different purposes. In the district, you're building relationships and you're showing impact, such as site visits. In DC, it's more policy focused and often staff driven. The goal is to have them both and build relationships so that they can reinforce each other. Next slide, please. So a few pitfalls to watch for. Try to avoid being too general in your communication with the offices. And if you're not actually making an ask, that's not actionable. So make sure you make a clear ask. Or talking too much about listening without listening and not following up. All of those things you want to avoid. Another big one is going alone. Working as a coalition makes you much harder to ignore. So bring your local and state level partners, diverse messengers in those offices, whether virtually or in person, to show them that you're not alone and this is a community ask. Next slide, please. So what can you do right now? Well, you can try to schedule a meeting with your member, either in district or in DC. You can engage partners to widen your reach. So bring them with you and also ask them to call the offices and emails to these offices. Submit coalition letters with diverse partners. Identify key messengers. So identify if your mayors or local legislatures have leverage over your members and try building those relationships. And start collecting and sharing local stories. This is the moment to act. Next slide. The thing you don't have to do in appropriations advocacy, actually in any advocacy, is that you don't have to do any of this alone. Bring your coalitions, non-traditional allies, community leaders, and use the toolkits and templates the Alliance has developed to make it easier. And really importantly, share wins. Talk about what worked and what didn't, and keep growing in your advocacy. And when possible, let us know how those meetings go. We are always here to support you. Next slide, please. So success can look a few different ways. It could be your member signs on to a funding request. It could be staff engagement increases, or it could be just that you're able to secure a meeting in those offices, which you weren't able to do before. And that, or your relationships with their staffers are getting stronger. All of those are indicators of success. Even small steps make the advocacy go forward. Next slide, please. So I will close with this. Appropriations is one of the most important windows for impact. Strategy matters just as much as passion. And your voice really does carry influence here, whether that's in district offices or in DC. The key is to start now, follow through, and then stay engaged until the process is over. With that, I will stop and pass it to my colleague, Charles, who's going to do a deeper dive on this. Charles.
Thank you, Tamina. I appreciate that. And good afternoon to everyone here. Thank you for being here with us. I want to use this time to walk through appropriations and budgeting and my personal experience with members' offices. a lot of people hear the term appropriations and think of something technical or procedural, but at its core, appropriations is all about choices. It's where priorities turn into funding decisions and where those funding decisions determine what moves forward right back at home in your local communities. At a high level, it helps to separate two things that are often blurred together: the federal budget, of course, which is a statement of priorities. It outlines what an administration would like to see happen and sets the overall target, but it doesn't fund programs on its own. And then the other piece, appropriation bills, which is where Congress provides the legal authority to actually spend the money that showed up in the chat when folks were prompted, what comes to mind when you think of appropriation? The first thing that came up was money. So that's correct. But appropriation actually helps execute the budget plan. This happens every year, which means there's always an opportunity to influence outcomes, but also a risk if priorities are not clearly communicated. Now, the process itself follows a general structure. Every year, the president releases a budget request, and then Congress takes over. The House and Senate Appropriations Committee divides the work across subcommittees, and those subcommittees write funding bills. For our work, that's primarily the THUD subcommittees. The House and Senate develops their own versions, and then those are negotiated before a final bill is passed. Now, ideally, this all happens before the fiscal year begins, but in reality, as we've seen recently, delays are common. As a matter of fact, we're in the middle of a delay on the Senate end. The most important point for you to understand is that this is not a closed process, and that a ton of decisions are shaped by input when we're actually in the middle of the appropriation process like we are now. And that's when staff are drafting bills, they're setting top line numbers, they're making trade-offs, and generally having discussions across the aisle. At this point, or at that point, decisions are not yet locked in. And a credible, well-framed input can directly influence outcomes. Now, I want to talk about my perspective from working on the Hill. As Tamina mentioned earlier, members of Congress typically fall into three buckets when it comes to appropriation issues, and even outside of appropriations issues. It's those members who are already supportive of the programs and policies that you care about. We have those who are right there, who sit right in the middle, or who are on the fence, and then we have those who are generally opposed to the policies that we care about or less inclined to engage. The strategy you use should shift depending on where they fall, and I want to walk through what that looks like in practice. Let's start with supportive members. Now, you often need to walk into offices when speaking to members of Congress who are already supportive of your issues, with the intention of expanding that support and, again, illuminating the importance of those issues to get that member of Congress to take even more steps forward to support your policies and programs. I've seen this play out in meetings where an office already agrees for the need of strong funding for a specific bill or program, but outside of those verbal agreements and those very, very positive meetings, they remain pretty quiet. They become passive supporters or champions in name only. In one specific case, a supportive House member who had consistently supported higher funding levels for programs that we cared about, but they consistently supported those higher funding levels. But what made the difference in the cycle was how advocates approached the conversation when they made the ask for them to do more. So instead of simply thanking the member for their past support of higher funding levels, they restated the issue. They came in with very specific district level data, along with the clear requests for the member to take an additional step. And that additional step was to turn their support into something actionable. And that actionable piece was signing on to an appropriations letter that a ton of their colleagues had already supported, but they were not on. And so that shift from general support to concrete action resulted in that member, number one, becoming more active in the process. And then years later, their names never left the appropriations letter. The reason these advocates approach work the way that it did was because supportive officers often need a clear pathway to act. They need you to clear the runway, so to speak. So if you give them a specific ask and a way to demonstrate that leadership, they are much more likely to follow through. On to the on-defense members, or those who are slightly in the middle, right? Who needs a little bit of encouragement. It may require a different approach than those supportive members. These are officers that are not opposed, but not yet fully bought in. And in my experience, this is where the most meaningful advocacy often happens. I recall a situation where the most meaningful advocacy happened in a member's office where they were hesitant about supporting a certain level of funding because they were concerned about overall spending levels. And they were facing a tough election that year. The conversation changed when advocates presented the issues in terms that were specific to that member. So they focused on the local economic impact and hundreds of jobs that the programs were tied to. The advocates also did something that moved the needle. They brought in a partner outside of the usual advocacy community. And in this case, it was a farmer who could speak to the economic impact in a way that really resonated with the office and that member. And over time, that changed the conversation. The office did not immediately become a champion and the needle didn't immediately move, but their hesitance moved from hesitation to openness. And ultimately, those conversations continued and they agreed to support maintaining those funding levels. Moving on to members who are mostly opposed or less inclined to engage, the strategy shifts again. The best path forward with these offices is often building awareness, right? It's that education piece and opening a line of communication to come back to the table later on. I've seen situations where an office was simply not responsive to traditional advocacy from national organizations, but engagement changed when local voices entered the conversation. And one example, I recall a coalition bringing together a group of Girl Scouts alongside a local organization to engage an office that had not prioritized environmental investments. So being very, very creative in that advocacy. And that combination of messengers makes it really, really hard to dismiss. In the end, the member didn't fully shift their position, but their staff became more engaged in appropriation discussions and environmental discussions, and then more open to ongoing communication. So basically that table stayed open and that door stayed open for many years after that. The reason this worked is that it introduced new validators, right? The Girl Scouts that came in, they validated a message, right? That local organization came in and they validated that message. And again, it completely opened doors for further conversations. Across all of these examples, the common thread is that effective advocacy is thoughtful and it's strategic. It's all about understanding your audience and being clear about your objective and tailoring your approach accordingly. And so the most effective engagements happen before decisions are finalized, like now, right? When again, we're in the middle of appropriation. So your engagement with members of Congress is so critical. The staff are still shaping those decisions and those recommendations, and they're looking for our input. There are a few takeaways I do want to leave you with. First, appropriations have real world consequences. Second, the process is structured, but it's not necessarily fixed, and that creates opportunities. Third, effective appropriations advocacy is about saying the right thing to the right person at the right time. And finally, your role is not just to raise awareness, but to help your decision makers act on your request. You want to make it easy for them to say yes. Last and not least, if there's one thing to remember about appropriations and the budget, is that it's that budgets are essentially a bucket of choices. Those choices are shaped by competing priorities and limited resources and information available at the moment decisions are made. So advocacy ensures that your priorities are a part of that decision-making process and that they're presented in a way that makes action possible. Um, with that, I want to pass it over to Tamina to open the floor.
All
Thank
right.
you,
Thank you,
Charles.
Charles and Tamina, so much. Sorry, Tamina.
No, I was about to say back to Alec for Q&A.
Perfect. Well, we're getting some great questions in the Q&A box and would encourage folks to keep sharing them. One question that we are getting in a lot of different ways is around some of the parameters that some of our partners, whether or not you're in a continuum of care or nonprofit provider, might face when trying to advocate, particularly around budget advocacy. Can we explore a little bit around like the extent to which budget advocacy constitutes lobbying, how to navigate that? In our follow-up email, we are going to share some specific resources around this. But is there any kind of general reactions, Timian and Charles, to how folks should be approaching budget advocacy if you have constraints around lobbying? What are kind of ways to still have some of these conversations, even if you can't make the specific ask?
You want to hop into Tamina and then I'll piggyback on that.
Oh, okay. I think it's helpful to think about advocacy beyond appropriation. So think about advocacy as the deeper relationship you have with your members' offices, the higher the chance that you will have an impact in the appropriations process. And really to start at the beginning, like just like any beginning of any relationship, is reaching out with as a resource. You are experts on a certain issue, or you have data that's helpful for local and community impact that your member might be interested in. So research your member, no matter which bucket they fall. Understand where they're coming from and try to reach them there and start building relationships accordingly. We have partners in let's just say difficult states where their members are generally opposers, but they still, in some parts, they still have good relationship with those offices. So I think it's always good to approach it as not like advocacy in the halls of Congress, but picture it as building relationship with your member and their staffers so that they understand your experience on the ground. Because that's the only way they would understand or they will know what's happening in your community. And if you don't say it, they will know. So just so more broadly, think about advocacy in that way. First, relationship building, and then halls of Congress.
Yeah, that's a great point. I just want to reiterate some of what Tamina said. The relationships are everything, right? And so, although you may be in the middle of the appropriations process when folks are talking about bottom line, top line numbers, um, making the case for programs and their return on investment, that's always a good bet, right? If you can do that, you're providing all the cover that you need, that member of Congress needs, to justify decision making when the rubber meets the road. And so I think that only happens when you can make a great case, right? In those offices, when you can continue to engage with your member of Congress. And when it's time to talk budget, they'll be tapping on the advocate's shoulder, right? Like, this is what we're running into in the caucus. What do you think about this? Right? Like, we're getting pushed back that this budget number is too high. We need your help on this. And I think that all starts with with relationships. The budget conversation sometimes comes way later on in that process. So great points, Samina.
If I could just put a quick cherry on top of that. So again, in our follow-up email with the slides and the recording, we will provide specific resources around what specific parameters look like, what are different tests that you can conduct as a 501c3 to kind of track what might constitute lobbying with the budget or just any kind of issue more generally. But it's important to know that, it is allowable. There are guardrails there in place to make sure you're not exceeding your limitations, but we will provide those specifics. And then to Charles and Tamina's larger point, I think there's a lot of ways that we've seen our advocates be very creative here. So even if you can't be the person saying, I specifically want $5.1 billion for the homeless assistance grants program, you can do a couple of things around member engagement and education. You can tell stories and share data about how impactful federal funding is to your community, how successful that has been, and you can also educate folks around what the impacts of cuts would be. So again, there's a lot of different kind of activities that you can take that can kind of get you to where you need to be, even if you might not feel comfortable or you might hit a limitation around sending a blast out to your whole network, encouraging them to take one specific action. So our team is always here to think creatively with you about how to do that, but we will again share some resources to facilitate your participation there. We're going to be shifting gears a little bit now. We get a question in the chat, a couple of them around the time frame. If we could back up and just go over the time frame a little bit again around when appropriation season kind of heats up again. Maybe we can say how things are supposed to be and then how things actually are, particularly in a year right now. When can we expect there to be the most impactful outreach to members? When is it most important for them to be hearing from us?
And so right now we're in the middle of the appropriation process. Typically, we would hope that, the Senate side, for example, their star right now, uh, in recent years, they would be done with markup or through the process already. The historical timeline for appropriations, we'll see this completed by the end of September. However, we've also seen a lot of chaos in Congress where the process, moved into the next year, like months later. So the most impactful time is always, certain touch points as it pertains to committee markups, right? House committee markups occurred in the most recent months, a month and a half ago, I believe. And then you have the Senate in the middle of their negotiations right now. So right now is the most impactful. The Senate's due or rumored to release their bill in July. And so I think that between now and the end of recess will probably be most impactful. The year gets very, very narrow and very, very small after recess, right? Like the number of days on the calendar to actually do work shrinks significantly. And so what that says to me is between now and recess, like those are great touch points, right? Those are great times to reach out to your members of Congress. That's great times to mobilize your coalition partners. After recess, right? We're dead in the middle of September, and folks are going to be putting the pedal to the floor to nail out like final details on what these appropriation bills will look like. To another point, there's also a contingency plan, right? In the more recent years, we've seen CRs or continuing resolutions become the finish line because there were no agreements on these appropriation bills, and essentially Congress had to keep the government open. That's also a great touch point. If we get to a point where we're looking at a possible government shutdown and there has to be some negotiations on the CR, that's also a great time for mobilization as well. So all the things that you fought for in these appropriation bills, you can also push for in a end of the year CR.
Thank you so much for that, Charles. And I think the number one thing I'm taking away from that is making sure that folks are signed up for our action alerts. That is the way that we communicate to you when it is most important for you to reach out to your legislators, especially now around the budget season. So we won't bug you too much, only when it's really important, but really making sure that you get in their ears at the most important times. Another question that I'm seeing here is actually not a question, but it's a really important comment that I just wanted to uplift and see if Charles and Tamina, you had any additional commentary. Jamie's adding here in the chat the importance of being able to focus on the impact of landlords in advocacy. I think we saw that especially in the last year where we were kind of struggling with a really disruptive and delayed HUD notice of funding opportunity announcement. And one of the main kind of talking points that we've seen was relatively more effective, particularly with conservative audiences and members of Congress, was focusing on the impact of landlords. How are those relationships going to be jeopardized in the short and the long term if there isn't a reliable source of funding? What does that look like in communities when those units are taken offline? What does that mean for those landlords who are oftentimes small businesses if it's a mom and pop landlord with only a handful of units? What's that going to look like if the funding is pulled out from under the rug? So, Jamie, just want to say that's a very helpful suggestion. Want to see if anyone else had anything to offer on that point.
I can start. As I mentioned in my presentation, the more diverse messengers you have in your advocacy, the stronger your advocacy. And landlords, especially smaller mom and pop landlords, have can have huge leverage. It's also small businesses in downtown areas. So I think for members of Congress and their staffers to understand that this is having an economic impact in their community. And even if they're small businesses, if they're small mom and pop rental landlords, they have a huge impact in making sure that X number of people are not made homeless, and impacting the whole community, right? So I think the goal is to diversify, as many diversify your advocates. Ideally, also bring in chambers of commerce. They essentially support most business enterprises within their jurisdiction, and really articulate the economic cost. If you have data, that's even better. The economic cost if those funds are taken away, like maybe the landlords can talk about, this is the amount of funding that I had or the subsidized rent that I could offer. If this goes away, it would mean that it will translate into X amount of people being homeless and back on the streets. So I think sort of making it practical and for people to visualize what that would look like is the most important thing.
Super helpful. Thank you, Tamina. Next question we had is, we are kind of focusing right now primarily on federal advocacy. That's kind of the main lane of the alliance, but obviously we want to be supportive of all the amazing work happening at the local and the state level. So the question we have is, can this process be replicated when engaging city councils and other officials on the local level, maybe even the state level? My initial sense is yes, right? Get even more personal, get even more, direct about bringing in local examples and local partners there, particularly because in my experience, folks at that level of government, those decision makers, hear from even fewer constituents, so your voice matters even more. But Charles and Tamina, what is your immediate reaction to that?
I think yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, when you go down the state level, these issues are a lot more intimate, right? These are folks who are in the community and they know this community, um, more than anyone on the federal level, right? They experience the same issues that you experience day in and day out. I think there will just simply be a tweaking your strategy, right? You would apply everything that we talked about today uh to what's happening on a super micro level, and not micro as in small, but micro as in outside of the macro strategic ask for whatever policies that you care about. You want to make sure that you're talking to the right decision makers on a local level, and typically on a local level you'll have one person that holds a ton of power within a local council. You have a person that holds a ton of power within the mayor's office. So getting to know those folks and building those relationships are so important. But absolutely, I think you can apply some of the lessons that we talked about here on a local level.
And just one thing I'll add to that is you can also ask your local mayors and council members to do advocacy with you. If you can convince them and show them like this is how the community will be impacted, they might be supporting the funding ask that you're also advocating for. And when congressional offices would hear from mayors, other stakeholders, public office holders in their own state or district, they will pay attention. So yes, you can do advocacy to them, but you can also bring them on your advocacy team and help them be a messenger for you in the congressional offices.
Perfect. Got another great question here. It's actually a good call-in from our friend Kathy. And she's essentially asking a question about how do we kind of square two different things, right? On one hand, we are trying to reinforce the message that we want to have a very clear, singular ask for members and their staff to have clarity. But on the other hand, the Alliance, we do have a lot of different advocacy asks related to the NOFO, different funding streams, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you kind of balance that when you have a lot of things that you need from a member, but you want to kind of keep things organized and to the point so they understand what they need to do? How do we kind of balance that?
I can hop in, into me if you want to hop in, you can as well. I think really organizing your meetings, all right, like before you step foot in offices, right, ensuring that you have a hierarchy of issues that you want to talk about. We know time is limited when you're advocating in front of members of Congress or anyone else. And then really leaning on like your fact sheets, right? Like in your materials. Like you may not be able to touch on everything or emphasize everything that you want to emphasize within that constrained time limit. But you also have your material to lean on and follow up emails and opportunities to focus on every piece of the advocacy as. And so I think you should make your meetings your own, but at the same time tailor them to whatever is important to you and your community. All these ideas are important, but you wanna plan it through, and once you plan it through, you'll have opportunities to hit those offices again or emphasize some pieces that you didn't get to emphasize during the actual meeting.
I would just say one like simple action you can take is schedule a check-in with your member's office and district every month or every other month. Just add that to your calendar, schedule a time with them, and then just be a resource with them. Whatever data you're finding, any changes, people with lived experience. There's so many ways you can advocate with them and just set up like a schedule, a calendar with their offices so that this is something that you would be doing, and also building relationship in the process.
Thank you so much, Charles and Tamina. And we're also getting a lot of great wisdom being shared in the chat. I just want to highlight that from some great advocates on this call. So thank you and keep that up. I'm not seeing any more questions. So Tamina and Charles, if there was one thing that you wanted folks to take away from this conversation, what would that be?
That there's no bad time to advocate, right? Like that the appropriation process and the budget process pretty much goes on the entire year, right? There's always a touch point which you can take advantage of. And so there's no bad time to reach out to a district office. There's no bad time to offer a site visit. There's no bad time to, schedule a virtual meeting with your member of Congress. Like that consistent engagement is so critical. And we just encourage folks to do it as much as they can.
I mean, appropriations, right? Like that's where the money is. So it is such an important part of our work. And so if we don't engage in advocacy, we may lose out, right? And advocacy is part of the policy making process. If we engage, we can impact. If we don't engage and take that opportunity to engage because it's part of the process, then we don't get to have a say in how those dollars and programs are run. So because it's appropriations and because advocacy is part of policy making, it is so integral that we take that opportunity to let our members know what the community needs. And if we don't, we miss out on a great opportunity and a chance to make an impact.
Perfect. Well, Charles and Tamina, thank you so much for joining today. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. As they say, time is money. And that means that I have a budget ask for all of you. Can you spend 2 minutes as soon as I turn off this webinar and fill out a very quick survey to let us know how this webinar was? We always look at it to get feedback, to get new ideas from you. So 2 minutes of your time, really quickly, just offer some feedback on this session. Again, really appreciate you all. Know that these times are trying, a lot of different competing priorities. We are here in your corner. Please feel free to always reach out, and we'll see you on the next call. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for joining. See you next time.